The first planet we want to consider is Mars as it relates to Aries ascendant. So we're going to start with Mars relating to Aries, and then of course we'll continue with Aries, looking at each planet onward, just to see how does the planet function for that particular ascendant. So first off, Mars. What do we know about Mars? Mars is a planet that moves extremely quickly. Mars is a sharp planet. Mars is a planet that likes to find logical solutions to things. Mars is a planet that engineers better situations. Mars is the warrior and the soldier, but not the warrior and the soldier that goes out looking for a fight. He's not the one that goes to the bar at 3 a.m. and picks a fight with anyone because he has a repressed, aggressive nature. The true version of Mars in its healthiest fashion is one that is strong, quick to take action, quick to solve problems, but chooses fights, chooses things to attack that are worth fighting. So it is the true valiant soldier that wants to defend one's family and one's country, but does not necessarily want to go out and maraud just for the sake of doing it. So Mars is an extremely powerful planet. It's capable of engineering new and positive situations, but it's also capable of great destruction if it's not working in its highest fashion. Now, when we think about Aries in the first place, what does Aries deal with? Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. And the zodiac itself represents the cycles of life. So anytime we have an Aries ascendant, we know that this individual, first and foremost, is going to be related to taking initiative, starting new things. There's going to be a strong focus on transitions within that person's life. And why is this the case? Because Mars rules for an Aries ascendant the first house as well as the 8th house. So for a Mars individual, there's going to be a lot of change. For an Aries ruled individual, there's going to be a lot of change. Wherever Mars is placed, the person is going to identify with that area of life. And this deals with houses, so we have to know what the houses mean. Please see my previous videos to explore that if you want. But wherever Mars goes for an Aries ascendant, that's going to show the area of life the person is going to be most directed to, as indicated by that house. But since Mars also rules the 8th house for an Aries ascendant, that's going to show us that while there's a lot of focus, there's going to be a lot of renovation, a lot of change, a lot of impulsivity if Mars is possibly in bad dignity, and so on. But the focus with Mars and Aries is that wherever Mars goes, that's the area of life. Whatever house the person, or whatever house that Mars goes into, that's going to be the area of life where there's more of a focus of attention to develop. There's also going to be more of a focus on making that house better, transforming it, engineering new ways to be in the indications of that house. And that, if you're around other people who are okay with that, that's fine. You put Mars in the 4th house for an Aries ascendant, there's going to be a lot of focus on home renovation. If you meet someone who doesn't really enjoy that, or would like to just have a nice, quiet home where nothing ever changes, that's going to be some difficulty, or that's going to create some difficulty. Sometimes Mars for an Aries ascendant shows a lot of cataclysmic change, where things just suddenly are radically different. You suddenly lose your job, but you find another job. You suddenly wreck your car, but you get another car. And how well that works is always going to be related to the dignity of Mars, generally speaking. The dignity of Mars, as well as any help it's gained from its friends through Lajatati Avashtas. Now, Mars is a planet of strength, a planet of courage, a planet that is willing to confront the unknown. Sometimes this can come across as a headstrong nature to that Mars. And that's where Aries gets this energy of the ram, this idea of the ram. But what we have to remember is that ability, that strength, that courage is all about breaking into something better. That's why the 8th house is always the house of transformation, always breaking into something better. For Aries, Mars is considered to be a temporary benefic because it's going to work well for an Aries ascendant. However, it could still be disruptive to other people. It can give a person, as I mentioned, a very headstrong attitude. It can make a person feel like their ways are the right way all the time, because Mars tends to think like that. But the better the dignity of Mars, the better the situation of Mars, the better off Mars will do for the individual in this regard. They will have good ideals if Mars is in better dignity, more than likely. They will be able to know when it's appropriate to pick a fight, or when it's appropriate to change, and when it's appropriate to leave things alone. This is why Mars typically makes someone a good engineer, and that's why when you meet an engineer, they're always fixing something. If something's not broke, they feel worthless, essentially. So Mars can be the great fixer in this regard. Now, when we think about Mars, where is Mars exalted for an Aries ascendant? Mars is exalted for an Aries ascendant in the sign of Capricorn, in Saturn's sign. That's interesting, because Saturn-ruled signs, especially Capricorn, are more restrictive, controlled type signs. So that tells us that the best kind of Mars is not one that is running rampant, as we've discussed, but it's the kind of Mars that is directed, that has a boundary, that has a code, that has a limit. And as long as that Mars stays within that code, that boundary, that limit, it will do well. That's why people with a strong Mars often do well in military type situations, or when I do charts for children and I'm looking at their Mars, I will often see children who have, say, an Aries ascendant and a Mars that is maybe in bad dignity or so on. And I will say the best way to work with that Mars is to give them structure and discipline. And the parent says, well, the child just can't stand that. But the thing about Mars is it respects sternness, which is a Saturn-ruled quality. It might fight against it, but once it finally sees it cannot fight against an authority, it will respect that authority. That's why Saturn can make Mars into a good soldier, by having that Mars exalted in the 10th house. But that's just a metaphor, so this can be taken to other levels as well. In business, when you get a Mars in the person's 10th house, that person needs to have a very specific plan of attack, and they respect people that bring that up. So we have to remember that with Mars and Aries ascendant, there will be challenges, there will be the aggressiveness of Mars, but it becomes cultivated by directing that aggressiveness, that need to fix things, to the specific house, more than likely, that Mars falls in. There will be a lot of transformation in that house. There will be a lot of change in that house. That's because Mars is trying to fix it, improve it, build upon it. But what Mars has to learn, by considering the fact that Mars is exalted in Saturn's sign in the 10th house, that there has to be limits to one's activity. There has to be boundaries to one's activity. Then Mars can work extremely well for an Aries ascendant. So no matter where your Mars is placed, if you think about these positive qualities, if you can try to cultivate these qualities, they will support wherever Mars is in your chart, as well as the general expression of Mars as part of your own divine makeup. We have to consider the fact that Mars is debilitated in Cancer, in the 4th sign. So that shows us that Mars doesn't do well sitting at home. Mars doesn't do well really getting into the emotional side of things. Mars needs to be active, doing things, fixing things. Cancer in the 4th house are more of a sattvic house. They're more of a house of simply being at peace with what is. So Mars, for an Aries ascendant, these aren't the type of people you really want to say, just be content with whatever, especially spiritually speaking. These are the kind of people that you have to give something to do, whether it's self-inquiry, whether it's practicing Kriya Yoga, whether it's doing something to direct that Martian energy. Inquiry is wonderful because it requires logic. Anything that's going to require them to use their logic to figure something out, that's what we have to do when we think about Mars for an Aries ascendant, related to the houses that Mars rules for an Aries ascendant, as well as the debilitation and exaltation signs that Mars has related to the Aries ascendant by house. Mars in the debilitated in the 4th house, Mars exalted in the 10th house. These mean specific things. And if we can think about those things and we can cultivate the positive side of those things, and not expect us to act, not expect an Aries person to act like as though they've got Mars in the 4th house. Maybe they do. But to cultivate that power and that strength and that balance of what Mars would do in the 10th. This is also why Mars people who are Aries ascendants tend to have very active and dynamic careers, and they're very focused on their careers, because that Mars in the 10th house drives them to being a defender of the Dharma, active in the world, improving the world, continuing that which supports life on this planet to function healthy and well, protecting those who can't protect themselves, improving upon situations for people who can't do it themselves. Mars also has a very strong protective energy. What we have to be very cautious of with Mars is turning things into a tribal war, because Mars would like to do that. When Mars starts to think that Mars knows everything, then we get the us versus them. And that creates a lot of pain, and that is not necessarily how a dharmic soldier functions. A dharmic soldier is interested in protecting those who need protected, fixing things that are problems, being okay taking chances, going on adventures. But a really good Mars will not attack anyone who is defenseless, or will not try to prove their point to anyone, because when someone is strong with Mars, they're comfortable within themselves. They don't have to go around and try to prove everything to everyone else. They'll talk about it if someone asks them, and maybe they enjoy expressing what they know. But if they come up against someone that just, it's like hitting a wall when it comes to having that kind of communication and conversation, a true Mars will just back off and say, look, there's nothing worth fighting about this, because I know what's true for me, and that's all that's necessary. But if someone keeps pushing and pounding the other person, trying to drive them to believe a certain way, then that Mars may lash out. Then that Mars may put them in their place, in a sense of defense for what they know to be their inner truth. Okay, so these are some thoughts on Mars for an Aries ascendant as it rules the 1st house, the 8th house, as well as having its exaltation in Capricorn, its debilitation in Cancer.